What benefits are there of mnemonics for the 21st century in your mind?
We can learn how to use memory palaces, but layer them and get more complexity, that we can use anything in the landscape, that we can learn that we can use devices like the African Lukasa as a memory device, and they're incredibly effective. And kids at school make these and use them very well. We can learn to put our knowledge into song and into dance and spend our lives singing. And that art is a phenomenal memory device. It's not just for prettiness, which it's often used for today. There's just so much we can learn from Indigenous cultures.
Teil 2 des Rethinking Memory Café Interviews mit Dr. Lynne Kelly über extrem effiziente Merktechniken, die mitunter 17.000 Jahre alt sind und von denen Monumente wie Stonehenge zeugen. Mehr noch, diese Monumente sind Gedächtnispaläste, Merkorte, mit deren Hilfe sich Kulturen, die keine Schrift besaßen, also Sprachkulturen, orale Kulturen, sich ihr ganzes Wissen merkten und über 17.000 Jahre lang bis in die Gegenwart fehlerfrei tradieren konnten. In diesem zweiten Teil lernen wir etwas mehr von diesen Techniken kennen und auch, wie wir sie auf uns im 21. Jahrhundert anwenden können, um schneller und besser und tiefer und langfristiger zu lernen. How in the world are huge piles of rocks, so to say, are being used specifically as a memory palace?
The trouble with picturing Stonehenge is you're picturing the great big sarsens with their lintels on top. I haven't got three hands. Mm-hmm. Those are 500 years into the life of Stonehenge. For the first 500 years, it was a circle of stones, 90-something stones around in what are called the Aubrey holes. So round and about 100 metres across with a ditch around it. Mm-hmm. So those were the blue stones from Wales. Now, stone, if you go and look at a stone, you'll see a whole lot of patterns in it. If you think about an elephant and look at the stone, you will find an elephant. Because, and the blue stones are particularly gobbly, got lots of bits and pieces, and especially when they're wet. Now, whether they bought them from Wales, because they were originally a stone circle in Wales, whether they brought them over because of that or because they were Welsh people moving over is still debated. And the very latest research tends to indicate they were Welsh people bringing their memory palace with them. So the ones they brought with them are blue stones. They're about 2 metres high, not those great big things. They come from 30K up the road. Mind you, they'd be harder to move 30K than the blue stones from Wales. So you've got now a circle, and each of those stones is sort of separate to each other. Mm-hmm. So you've got exactly what you're doing in your home. Each room is each stone, but that stone's got all these bits and pieces. So you now at that first stone have to memorise, how the husbandry of pigs, for example. And we know that the ceremonies were when the pigs were about 9 months old from the remains, and there's deposits in the ditches around that are repeated hundreds of years apart. They've got a pig skeleton of the same age and other things. So we know that this is just perfect as a memory palace. Why the ditches? And this was the strongest part of my whole thesis, according to the archaeologists, because no one else has explained why the ditches in the Neolithic were flat-bottomed, always had flat bottoms. When you get to the Bronze Age, the Iron Age in particular, they changed them to V-shaped defensive. They're not defensive, but if you think of them as a performance site, England's weather is crap. And if you've got a ditch, they're about 2 metres deep and in segments. I can go on and on about the ditches for hours, but you can cover them. And the imperative is you must perform those ceremonies and moving round them over the annual cycle, because otherwise you're going to forget them. And so there's always a ceremonial cycle in all Indigenous cultures to make sure the ceremonies, which is performing the knowledge, is done regularly. I can go on and on about how that all works, and the acoustics. Can you imagine a chalk ditch? It's like a shower. Can you imagine the acoustics? And chalk is white with the torches bright and shiny. I've begged my husband to dig me one, but he won't. So when you go to Durrington Walls, okay, I'll get to Durrington Walls in a second. So then after 500 years, they moved those stones into the middle and they put the great big ones around it, the big sarcens, which is what you think of when you think of Stonehenge. But in the side are these smaller stones. So they've protected them. They've made them extremely restricted. You can't even see them from outside in the remodeled. My theory messes up then because I've got a restricted place but not a big public place at exactly that time archaeologically, but we are talking within years. The much bigger henge at Durrington Walls is built and the ditches there go 10 metres deep. Can you imagine singing at the bottom of a 10-metre high shower?
Oh, wow.
And it goes for a kilometre. There is 1 million hours to dig that out. And don't forget, they only had deer antlers to dig it out with. They didn't have mechanical diggers or even stonework, ironwork or anything.
Wow.
They didn't do that for nothing. And it must have been totally extraordinary. But then you've got a public place there. You've got the restricted place at Stonehenge, only 3 kilometres apart, 3 miles apart. Oh, I get my units all mixed up. And then they had Woodhenge there, which was restricted. And there's a whole lot of more stuff, plus all the cairns, which are restricted. I can go on for hours and hours. I could write an entire book on it.
Which you have.
Yeah, the details of that are in the academic book, the Cambridge University book, Knowledge and Power.
Okay.
In prehistoric societies, but that's really expensive with all the people's names in brackets and all that sort of stuff.
But
it got heavily reviewed. Cambridge University Press do not publish something without really hardcore reviewing.
I see. So just for me to get this right, so what you said is those ditches, like the holes in the ground, right, were the places where they sang their memory songs, right? And
the holes, the Aubrey holes, are where the stones were, blue stones were originally before they moved them into the centre. The ditches would have been the ceremonial performance places. It might have been the only performance place, but there is no other explanation on why they worked so hard at Avebury, at all the henges. Find me a henge where the ditch isn't flat-bottomed, and my theory just fell over again.
Okay, I see.
It doesn't exist.
That's very interesting.
And that took me months of work because the cross-section of the ditches wasn't considered a very important issue, but it was really important to me.
I see.
And yeah, every one that they've excavated is flat. And Avebury, which is the biggest of them, the archaeologists report how much effort they had put in to have the bottoms flat. And we're 10 metres down. The stones at the top are trivial compared to these ditches.
I see. And
they don't look trivial to us now because the ditches are filled in a fair bit.
So the other archaeologists or the archaeologists weren't able to make sense of this, right? But you were, because you, like, with your new theory, you were like tying up all the different pieces, right?
I had an advantage, I think, in not being an archaeologist, but being married to one. So I had, because I was looking at it from the perspective of how do you perform the ceremonies necessary to memorize and then teach and distribute all the knowledge. So yes, that was why I looked at it differently. The only theories around about the ditches are they did it to show that they could, that different groups did it to compete with each other. Indigenous cultures do not do things for no good reason, especially not a million work hours.
Yeah, I could imagine that if you only have, like, I don't know, a shovel or whatever. Well,
they didn't have shovels. Deer antlers, the antlers of red deer.
Oh, really?
Are the tools they use, and they know that because they left some of them around.
Oh, wow. Oh, my goodness.
So you're using deer antler to dig into chalk, which is stone,
Wow.
and dig a kilometre ditch and in places 10 metres deep. I mean, it's extraordinary.
It is.
I really want one. I really, really want one.
You have to ask your husband if he's going to build you like a little Stonehenge in your garden, right? As a memory
Yeah,
palace.
he said no. But I use the garden as a memory palace. We happen to have a stone wall, so I'm used to staring at stone, and we have some little standing stones. They're only this big. But even a stone that big, once you start staring at it, you will see so many patterns in it. And you know the human brain, it looks at clouds and sees puppies.
That's true.
Your brain will create the patterns you want, and every stone will be very different. And they talk about the avenue at Avebury as each of the big stones. They thought they were female and male because they kept trying, each one was so different from the one before. But that in setting up a memory palace, that is absolutely essential. So, of course, they made them as different as they could. And one of my Aboriginal colleagues, Nungarai, who's Warlpiri, for anyone who wants the Aboriginal culture, said to me, when you walk that avenue, walk it slowly, rhythmically, thinking in terms of the knowledge. And as you do, each pair of stones the stones come into view, and they're spaced so you're only really aware of one pair at a time. It is perfectly set up as a memory palace going into the henge. This is Avebury, the biggest of the henges.
That's so awesome.
But I couldn't have done it without Indigenous people saying this is the way you need to think, because it was such a different way of thinking.
I could imagine. So tell us a little bit about more of their techniques. Like they've used like big monuments, like you said, right, as memory palaces. What other mnemonic techniques did they use to memorize such vast amount of information?
Right. The first thing they all use is song. So you want performance-based songs. I don't know how good you are on the pop songs that you can't get out of your head compared to the lecture you had at university. The song is going to stick.
That's why that's why I listen to heavy metal, because it's more difficult to get stuck in your head.
But why not use things that do get stuck in your head? But why do we spend our life singing about he loves me, I can't live without him? Why not do what Indigenous cultures do? They sing the whole time, but they're singing their knowledge. Song is important. So there must be performance spaces. Otherwise, it's useless. Dance, movement. So the more all Indigenous cultures will move and add out that story, because we're naturally a storytelling machine and stories are easier to remember. And therefore you've got characters. And I grossly underestimated the importance of characters until I got to my next book, Memory Craft, and to actually implementing them. But they use characters to tell stories. Plus, they use handheld memory devices. And those I had no idea about and still shocked me completely. So then I said, well, then at Stonehenge, there has to be, all of these indicators, there has to be handheld devices. These are the Neolithic carved stone balls in Scotland. That's a wooden one, obviously, but so those would act as a memory device. At Stonehenge, there's the chalk plaques, Stonehenge chalk plaques, which my husband and I examined some at Salisbury Museum. So they are etched pattern plaques, lumps of chalk that have just been put aside as enigmatic, have no reason. They're exactly what Indigenous cultures use for memory devices. And until I tried using one, I would never have believed it possible. I found them everywhere. Absolutely everywhere. And you've got evidence like some of these are constantly mended, like the grooveware pots in the British Neolithic, constantly mended past their use. Now, this was Dr. Ros Cleal, the archaeologist's thesis, was the fact that they had mended them past their use, but they didn't have a reason. And I was just said to her, they're memory devices. So even though they're no longer holding the liquid, they still are the memory device. So we've got an Aboriginal. Here's an example. This is Australian Aboriginal. Coolamon is a food dish because they move a fair bit. They are not nomadic. They do not wander aimlessly. They know the landscape very well, but they do move between resources. And on the back are all these markings.
Interesting.
Now, this is a girl's one. This is Walpuri. I was granted custodianship because these are precious objects. You can't own them.
Mm-hmm.
I've just got to use the correct terminology. I was granted custodianship of this because the elders and the ancestors wanted me to start telling people about this intellectual achievement.
Wow.
So you would think that that would work as a memory device.
Mm-hmm.
It works unbelievably well. I have encoded to this the habitats of Victoria. There's the coastal habitats and mountain habitats. It's back to front because I'm looking at the pictures.
Mm-hmm.
But it works unbelievably well. So the chalk plaques, every monumental site I looked at, I could find these sort of devices.
Wow, that's really very, very interesting.
I wouldn't have gone looking, and nor would I have interpreted that way, except that that's what Aboriginal people and Native American and African were telling me to look for, in particular African and Aboriginal.
That's really, really interesting. So, so basically what you're saying is like every object could basically be used as a memory palace, right?
Not as a memory palace, as a memory device.
Memory device, right. Mm-hmm.
Every decorated object except, now people keep sending me pictures of the Roman dodecahedrons.
What's that?
They're metal objects that people say, hey, nobody knows what they were used for. Hey, they must be a memory device, you've solved it. Unfortunately, it doesn't work for them because they're very symmetrical. They're identical in all directions. That will not work as a memory device. But the carved stone balls in Scotland, this is a copy of one, but it's made in wood because, so you've got etchings on them.
Mm-hmm.
That will work. It does. This is one I use for my ceremonial cycles. So that will work very well. I've got that. I didn't bring it down to have here with me, but one that's got a whole stack of knobs on them. So that was one of my tests, because in the photos I'd seen before I went to England and Scotland, these are all Scottish, if it's got 120 the knobs on it, you couldn't get a sequence, I thought. And then my theory just got falsified. But when I got it and held it, I could immediately find a pattern and a sequence straight away. And I said to the curators, can you see that? And they put it down, shuffled it, picked it up again, and could sequence it every time.
Wow.
And so we didn't find a single one that couldn't be sequenced. That
wooden ball, right? Yeah. You just held. How many loci do you find on such a ball?
As many as you want. If you started, some of them are plain with only the 6. So about 50% only have the 6 knobs. But as soon as they were possibly painted. There's the slightest indication they were painted, but we don't know. But if you look at stone, so even if you look at that, the marks I've put on it, I'll try and get the light right, but then start looking at the grain and the bits in between. And they did mark bits in between. Plus the way you hold it work because your hands are different.
Okay.
I just can't believe I've got that doing lots and lots of ceremonies and songs. I couldn't encode any more to it because my brain wouldn't cope with any more, but there's probably 100 songs.
Oh, wow.
Just reminding me which song to sing in which order to make sure I sing all of them regularly. Once or so a year. Just to make sure it comes back and it's retained. And that's why you'll find that Indigenous cultures have a ceremonial cycle over a year and so they'll sing the stuff for, what resources are available in October. They'll sing that at the ceremonies in October or just before. And they have a ceremonial cycle to make sure. So some things get lost because they're not useful anymore, and some they'll add in new things. But they'll retain a corpus of songs, dances, ceremonies.
That's amazing. Let me just see, because we covered a lot of ground already.
We've barely started.
Yeah, it feels like it, right? Hold on. Let me trim down on it a little bit more. So if you compare the Greek memory devices to the ancient memory devices, what difference in particular did you find?
The Greek methods are simpler because they use the memory palace. So we're talking Cicero and all those people, and what we've learnt from the book written by Anonymous. He writes a lot, but he wrote a really important book back there, the Rhetorica ad Herennium. And so they use each location for memorizing a piece of information to give a speech or whatever. Got to remember, in ancient Greek, they wrote on stone. So we didn't all have books and bits of paper. You know, way back, they still use their memories a lot. But they would give a speech, whereas an indigenous songline, they will put down that original bit of information and ground it literally, and then they'll build on it. So you might learn the interaction between particular ant and the availability of honey at one location, but then you'll get more and more information built on it as you get higher and higher initiated, but it'll also be ethics. They don't separate the information like we do. They meld all the ethics and stories and knowledge and all together. So they will then layer and layer and layer, which is what I do with my memory palaces. They will not, it's not like just one speech or a card person just memorizing a deck of cards. They will keep it and layer it higher. So, but the Greeks didn't need to do that anymore because they did have writing, and they also had specialists, whereas an Aboriginal elder will be over all the knowledge of the culture. So all, you know, animals, plants, genealogies, navigation, laws, land management, you know, all of it. Whereas once you get to bigger societies, and this is the big change you get in the Bronze Age and so on, you start to get your farmers specialising and your metal workers and lawyers. It starts to be separated. So you don't need as much level of complexity.
I see.
Nor to work as hard at it. So the Greek ones are a simplified version of these old methods, which is logical if you look at the sequence, how they will have simplified it to what they needed. It's all practical. Aboriginal people are the most pragmatic people I've ever met. As Nilbrai said to me right at the beginning, the elders were pragmatic old buggers. We wouldn't have survived if they weren't.
Funny.
Yeah, and that's not a swear word in that use.
I see.
Yeah. Apologies to anyone who's offended, but it refers to a sort of stubborn old person.
I see.
And they were pragmatic. And so that's what you see in the changes over history in the memory devices and then into the medieval ones, which I'm now obsessed with, because they adapted to what they needed.
I see. What do you mean exactly by layering their information? Like how could we understand this a little bit better?
Okay, let's use my main memory palace that I'm sitting in at the moment, which is the countries. I've got the 242 countries and independent protectorates in the world, starting up there and churning around the world, churning around the house and garden and then down the street. So you put in each country. And then, so I go, you know, China, India, USA, I'm up pointing to my studio. So you get to number 8, which is Bangladesh, the 8th biggest in the world by population. Bigger than, you know, about the same as Russia, bigger than Japan, Mexico, Germany, England, France, Italy, all of those. And so now I've got all those countries in, then you start seeing patterns. How come Bangladesh is so big and yet it's not featured heavily in history? It hasn't colonized or invaded the world or all this sort of thing. So you start asking questions and seeing patterns. And that's where people that believe you can just use Google are missing out. That's useful for burrowing down to information you know exists. But without those patterns, you're not going to understand. And now we're going to get to Socrates any moment, I hope, because that's what he talked about. So now I've got all the countries in. I can start putting the capitals. At the moment, I'm putting in, I've got in the populations, which as I read the coronavirus information, I'm able to do population comparisons. Because in my memory palace, I know, hang on, this country's got a huge deaths per million. Hang on, it's way down the street there. It's a little tiny country that's had 6 deaths. They had a little cluster, but that looks massive because the population's small. So I've got the entire population of the world, because I put them in an order of population. So I've got all these layers. I can now add everything I want about the countries and start seeing patterns.
That's beautiful. That's also what I what I myself found when I used to memorize the whole Bible. Actually, like it has 1,189 chapters, and what I did was going through all the chapters and memorizing the chapter number, and then the stories because I found as a Christian it was really hard for me sometimes, when people would ask me like, where do you find this story, where do you find that, or when you wanted to quote something, right? You just were like, I barely, like, vaguely know this and that verse, but I couldn't have found it if I wanted to, right? So I was like, I want to put it in the memory palace and kind of like know what it's all about. And what happened to me was, it was really interesting. I used to see patterns in the stories. And what I then found, I knew this before from various theological literature, but what I then found was that actually, like, how biblical books would be arranged was in a certain structure, which is called chiasmus. I don't know if that's in English, if that's pronounced well properly, but we in German say chiasmus, right? So it's like a cross structure. It has, like, there would be story A, and then on the end of the book would be story A as well, and then starting right in, like, on the beginning of the book, there would be story B right next after A, for example, and then at the end there would also be, if you would go this way, right? So it would be AA, BB, and then in the middle would be story C, right? And this would be the focal point of the whole book. And if you know that structure, you can see what the author was intending to tell. Like, the story would have a purpose, it would have, like, a goal, and in the middle there would be the moral of the story, or the key element, or the whatever he wanted to emphasize, right? So with that structure, you actually, if you put it in a memory palace, you see structures, and you can compare. Like, if you for example, if you memorize the book of Genesis, like I did, you see, like, different stories of people, like 4 tribal people of the tribes of Israel, and you can compare them with each other, and you see patterns emerging, and which tells you, like you said, a lot of both moral things as well. You can apply that to your life a lot better. It's really beautiful.
The Bible, there's quite a bit of research, especially Mary Carruthers is a writer on medieval and that, but also Francis Yates, who wrote The Art of Memory. But people talk about the way the Bible verses are designed because they were broken down to memorable stages. So everything you're saying will match the way it's come from oral tradition and then been adapted to be memorable. But not only is it that you see patterns you wouldn't see otherwise, and this is why Google, you can go down to a particular verse, but you're not going to get that pattern. I've found that it's also motivated me to find out more, because now I've got a whole lot of countries in this memory palace. Tuvalu, which apparently I pronounced wrongly. Who are they? I want to know. And I want to know, why is Bangladesh? And there's a whole lot of good reasons why it hasn't appeared in the way it has, the way other countries that colonized the world did. But those hooks, once you've got them, not only are things more memorable, but it starts to get more interesting. And you do have to be careful not to put things in the wrong place. I went and put Samoa in the fruit shop down the street by mistake, and I had Sam serving me fruit, and then found that I'd skipped 2 and that Samoa was supposed to be down in the butcher. So for a year at least, Sam had to walk out of the fruit shop, down to the butcher and go into his butcher to get me Samoa in the right place. He now stays put in his butcher, you'll be pleased to know. But it's very hard once you've put something into a memory palace to get it out again.
Yeah, I know.
Ghosts, it's called. You know, you end up with ghosts all over the place. That's how effective these methods are. And until I did it, I wouldn't have believed it.
So going back to the ancients or the Greeks, so when they invented writing, right, or when writing came or whatever, and they had the ability to, and also the means to write down things finally, because they had papyrus and whatever. Did memory or did mnemonics not become obsolete?
Absolutely not, because not only was papyrus incredibly expensive, but they were taught on wax tablets, which they then erased. So if it wasn't in memory, it's gone. You can't take it home and stick it in your library. So, no, memory didn't become obsolete. And as Socrates said, if you can't, his big fear with writing, which he didn't write, that's why stuff is written down by Plato, if you lose your memory, I think not only do you lose the skills of being able to memorize and see these patterns, you'll lose the ability to be creative, because how do you create something new, and that's what the definition of creative is, if you don't have something to build it on? And that's what worries me a lot about education. I know we're going to get to education, is that I'm worried that we're doing too much of the higher level learning of synthesizing and hypothesizing everything without giving a firm base on which to build that knowledge and those structures. And it's the patterns you were talking about and the set of countries that pattern anchors it literally in the landscape. And that base allows you to go berserk.
Yeah.
Mental.
So can you go a little bit into the practical side of things? I know we're going to do this in the next session when we're talking about the memory craft and whatever, but can you give us a little bit about insight about especially what the medieval writers talked about how to memorize effectively? Like what are the nitty-gritty details? What could we learn from them right now in the 21st century? How are we going to use our memory palaces effectively?
Right, the medieval writers had quite a lot to say about this, about using art in particular. But if you're going to memorize stuff and this is a whole chapter of memory craft, which we're doing in the next section, don't type your notes. They all look the same. And as soon as it all looks the same, it's not memorable. So that's why they used pretty, different leading letters, and why the verses were small, and they left room for people to annotate, and they did little drawings around everything to make every page look different. Your brain loves novelty. And I worked with neuroscientist Dr. Jenny Roger, who's an expert on the plasticity of the human brain. And if I can say one thing to everybody, if you want to get, I'm 68, if you want to get old and keep your memory, it's a muscle. It's got to be exercised. And they're now showing that plasticity does not decay. If you use your memory, you can keep laying down new neural networks. And they've got people at 100 still laying down new neural networks. And association with place and music are the two things held most deeply. And every Indigenous culture uses memory palaces, place and music. So they're two key. So the big things are memory palaces are natural to the human brain. Music is natural to the human brain. Novelty. That's why the stories have, like fairy tales, but all the Indigenous stories have wildly ugly, wildly beautiful, extremely good, extremely bad, violence and sex, all the things that make them memorable. And if you start using memory palaces, fortunately, nobody can read my mind, because it does keep adding in violence and vulgarity to remember things. And I tell it not to, that I'm not like that. but it ignores me completely. And those are the most memorable stuff anyway. So what we've learned from Indigenous cultures, medieval stories, and so on is that these things make stuff more memorable, plus using memory devices. In the medieval times, it was the manuscripts and art and church windows and, of course, memory palaces, which is just an adaptation of the Indigenous stuff.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Thank you very much. I think also this, the practical side is also very valuable for our listeners because we, as memory geeks, we want to kind of, learn from each other and dig deeper and know how to improve our techniques so that we could improve our knowledge and memory as well. So this is very valuable. Thank you very much. So we come to our last bunch of questions for this session, which has been quite long, but it actually didn't felt that way. It didn't feel that way.
It's getting darker outside.
It's okay. It's still okay, I think. So what would you say in the 21st century? We have papers and books and phones and tablets. Like we can make notes everywhere, right? So are mnemonics not completely obsolete today?
Do you want to look up everything the moment you see it? So every country in the world, I've got to look up. I don't know what continent it's on or anything. And in particular, I hope in the next session we'll talk about learning languages. Mm-hmm. That out of the memory code, I get a lot of emails, and I thought they'd all be about the archaeology. 90% were how do we use this, and probably of those 20 or 30% were how do we use them for foreign languages. I don't know how you learn a language without memorizing things. History, if you learn one, so I've got a history trail that we'll probably talk about. You see the patterns, what's going on at the same time. Without a memory palace or without memory, you've only got what's written down that you can look up. You cannot get these big patterns. And I don't think creative thinking can happen without good memory. Mm-hmm. And I've got a very bad memory, but without memory techniques.
Me too. That's why I started with memory techniques, actually. I used to quarrel a lot with my dad because of the fact that I used to forget so many things we discussed on, and he was like, he said, I want you to be on time or whatever, and I want you to keep this and that in mind. And I said, yes, I will. But I eventually forgot. And I really did. And I couldn't remember it. And he was getting mad at me because he thought, I would make a fool of himself or of him and be like very unkind to him. Like I didn't, as a son, right? Didn't really estimate him as a person of authority. So this was kind of like the tale of my adolescent years, and that's what started me on the mnemonics trail.
My mother described me as the vaguest child she'd ever known.
What's vaguest?
Vague. Mm-hmm. Nothing settled. I couldn't remember things. And she'd ask me a question. I'd sort of look confused. I couldn't recognize faces. And at school, it was only maths that I was any good at, and only because I could work out everything from first principles. So, yes, I struggled with memory. I don't anymore. I can memorize anything.
That's great. I have prepared a quote from your book, which is here. I don't know if everyone can see it.
Memory Craft, right?
Yes, the Memory Craft. So we'll talk about this wonderful book in the next session. And I wanted to read something out of it because I think there is a brilliant quote in there. And I want to ask you a question about it. So this is a quote by how do you pronounce it? Socrates. Right? Yeah, Socrates, and it was recorded by Plato, who tells a fictive I can't speak anymore. Who tells a fictitious story about the problem of forgetfulness. through writing. And he says, for this invention, writing, will produce forgetfulness in the minds of those who learn to use it, because they will not practice their memory. Their trust in writing, produced by the external characters which are no part of themselves, will discourage the use of their own memory within them. You have invented an elixir not of memory, but of reminding. And you offer your pupils the appearance of wisdom, not true wisdom. For they will read many things without instruction, and they will therefore seem to know many things when they are, for the most part, ignorant and hard to get along with, since they are not wise, but only appear wise.
That's beautiful. Socrates, I mean, that's writing. What would he have thought of technology? Obviously, as an author, I love writing and I love technology, but I also love memory. My life is so much richer since I started using these methods because I'm seeing patterns and asking questions, and everything that I have a foundation in that memory palace from then on is a hook that I want to add more to. I am never bored.
So closing with a final question, how can we learn from indigenous cultures today? What benefits are there of mnemonics for the 21st century in your mind?
We can learn how to use memory palaces, but layer them and get more complexity, that we can use anything in the landscape, that we can learn that we can use devices like the African Lukasa as a memory device, and they're incredibly effective. And kids at school make these and use them very well. We can learn to put our knowledge into song and into dance and spend our lives singing. And that art is a phenomenal memory device. It's not just for prettiness, which it's often used for today. There's just so much we can learn from Indigenous cultures.
Thank you very much. For a final, can you just tell us where people can find you and where can they buy your wonderful books?
They can find me at my website, lynnekelly.com.au, because I'm in Australia, not Austria. AU is Australia. So it's LYNNEKLLY, and just Googling that'll find my website. And my books are on Amazon, Booktopia. Booktopia is the Australian one, Book Depository. But all bookshops can get them because they're published here and in America and England. And
I see. But there is also another writer, right? That bears the same name as you.
Yes, a young adult writer in America. So no, I didn't write Whale Song or what it is she wrote. So no, I'm me.
Okay.
And Wikipedia has an article on me.
Oh yeah, right.
And her. But our books are very different. I don't write young adult fiction. Well, I did. I have published one young adult fiction, but it won't appear anywhere.
Yeah, I saw that. I think I saw it.
Yeah, Avenging Janie. I did have it on Amazon. It is at the moment, but I'm changing things.
Okay, I see. Well, thank you.
But it was published many, many years ago as a proper book. But then I got into nonfiction and haven't got out of it again. I want to write both.
Maybe we'll see some fiction books as well in the future from you. That would be nice.
There's talk of that. I don't know at the moment. I've just finished Songlines. It's just gone into editing.
Okay.
And I'm mentally tired. And I really want to get into art more. And French and Chinese. But we'll talk about those when we talk about memory craft.
Right. Thank you very much, Lynne, and see you in the next session.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Florian. Thank you.
Im Teil 3 und Teil 4 dieses Interviews mit Lynne Kelly wird dann ihr Buch Memory Craft vorgestellt und dort sprechen wir ganz besonders über die Anwendung dieser Merktechniken im 21. Jahrhundert, ganz besonders auf das Schulsetting. Also wenn du zum Beispiel ein Lehrer bist oder selbst gerade in der Schule, hier spricht Lynne Kelly über ihre reichhaltige Erfahrung in der Anwendung mit diesen alten Merktechniken im Schulsetting. Das solltest du auf jeden Fall auch nicht verpassen. Wenn du Interesse an den Büchern von Lynne Kelly gefunden hast, dann klicke einfach auf die Episodenbeschreibung. Dort findest du Links zu den einzelnen Büchern The Memory Code und Memory Craft. Ankündigungen spannender Interviews mit spannenden Interviewpartnern findest du übrigens immer auf Instagram und auch auf Facebook. Du kannst uns einfach auf Instagram, Facebook und YouTube folgen. Die Links dazu findest du unten in der Description. So bleibst du immer am Laufenden und verpasst keines dieser spannenden Interviews. Außerdem sicherst du dir so die Chance, beim nächsten Gewinnspiel mit dabei zu sein und Coaching mit mir zu gewinnen.